I don't know what made me decide to go camping alone that weekend. Maybe I just needed the quiet, or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. My parents were the ones who had made camping a tradition in my life, and while I loved it, I had never done it by myself. But that Saturday morning, I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and headed out to a remote part of the state where few people went, a place I had read about but never visited. The forest was dense, the roads winding and narrow. It took me nearly an hour of dirt trails before I finally reached the small clearing by the river where I planned to set up camp. The first couple of hours were peaceful. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and even walked down to the river to splash some cold water on my face. The sun was still high, and everything felt normal. But as the afternoon wore on, something about the place started to feel off. At first, I told myself it was just the isolation, that I wasn't used to being alone in the wilderness. But the feeling didn't go away. Around sunset, I started hearing noises. Not normal forest noises, those I was used to. This was different. A branch snapping nearby, the rustle of something large moving through the brush. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but something about it felt deliberate, like whatever was out there was moving with purpose. Watching, I tried to shake it off and focused on getting a fire going. The crackling flames brought some comfort, but that feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the glow of my campfire. The trees were tall, their branches thick and tangled, making it impossible to see beyond a few feet. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement, but it was always too quick, too subtle. As night settled in, the noises got worse. Twigs snapping, footsteps, actual footsteps, circling my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the trees, but I saw nothing. The light barely penetrated the thick forest, the shadows shifting in ways that made my stomach twist. I called out once, a simple hello, just to break the silence, but the only answer was more rustling. I knew animals could be curious, but this didn't feel like an animal. And the longer I sat there, the more I felt like something was just beyond my line of sight, standing in the darkness, waiting. I made the decision right then. I wasn't staying. I doused the fire, stuffed my essentials into my backpack, and grabbed my keys. My truck was parked about 50 feet away, just past the treeline. I wasn't going to waste any time. As soon as I stepped away from the firelight, the night felt heavier. The air was thick, the silence almost deafening. Every step I took, I expected something to lunge at me from the darkness. I forced myself to move faster, my flashlight bouncing off the trees as I hurried toward my truck. Then I heard it. A voice, not loud, not clear, but enough that my heart stopped. It wasn't coming from behind me. It was ahead, near my truck. I froze, my grip tightening around the flashlight. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I scanned the area ahead, my truck barely visible through the trees, but I saw no one. Still, the voice had been real. A whisper, maybe, or a low murmur. I couldn't tell what it had said, but it had been there. I took a step forward, then another. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I needed to get to my truck. I needed to leave. The moment I broke through the trees, I saw it. Something moving behind my truck, just a dark shape, too fast to make out. I didn't wait. I sprinted the last few feet, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut behind me. My hands fumbled for the keys, my breathing ragged. The truck roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, my headlights cutting through the darkness as I tore out of there. I didn't stop driving. Not until I was miles away, back on a main road, with the safety of streetlights and gas stations ahead. I never found out what was out there. I never went back. I told myself it was probably just another camper messing with me, maybe some local who didn't want strangers on their land. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something had been there that night, and it had been waiting. Camping has always been something I enjoy. The quiet, the escape from everything. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot, the distant calls of birds. It's peaceful, or at least it usually is. Last summer, I decided to take a solo camping trip to a remote spot in the woods. I wanted isolation away from the usual campgrounds filled with people. I found a location deep in a national forest, far off the beaten path. There was no cell service, no marked trails, just wilderness. It was exactly what I was looking for. I packed enough supplies for 3 nights: tent, food, water, a knife, flashlight, and other essentials. I parked my truck off a dirt road, hiked about 3 miles into the woods, and set up camp near a small, slow-moving creek. The place was perfect. Dense trees on all sides, soft ground for the tent, and the soothing sound of water nearby. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, ate my meal, and listened to the night sounds. No strange noises, no eerie feelings, just a normal night in the wilderness. The second day, I explored the area. I followed the creek for a while, looking for animal tracks, and climbed a small hill that gave me a view of the endless forest stretching out before me. I felt completely alone in the best way possible. That night, after finishing my dinner, I threw the last of my firewood onto the flames and settled into my tent, feeling relaxed and content. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I just felt off. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim, reddish glow around the campsite. I listened carefully. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, nothing moving, just silence. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps, slow, measured, moving around my campsite. I lay completely still, my heart hammering. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. I hadn't seen another person for miles. My truck was parked far from any official campsite. I was deep in the woods, alone. The footsteps continued. Not the quick, random steps of an animal, but something or someone moving with purpose. My knife was in my pack, just outside the tent. My flashlight was within reach, but I hesitated to turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want to let whoever or whatever was out there know I was awake. Minutes passed. The footsteps circled my campsite twice, then stopped. I strained to hear anything, any hint of movement. Nothing, just the crackle of dying embers and my own breathing, too loud in the silence. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, daylight was filtering through the tent walls. I unzipped the tent slowly, peering out. Everything looked normal. No footprints, no disturbed gear, nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I debated packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a deer had wandered into my camp. Maybe my half-asleep mind had exaggerated the sounds. I decided to stay one more night. That evening, I built my fire early. I wanted as much light as possible. As the sun set, I sat with my knife close at hand, scanning the tree line, listening to every little sound. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself I had overreacted the night before. Then, just as I was about to turn in, I heard it again. The footsteps, slow, deliberate. But this time, they weren't circling the campsite. They were coming straight toward me. I jumped up, grabbing my flashlight and knife, shining the beam in the direction of the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew I wasn't alone. I wasn't gonna wait to find out what it was. I kicked dirt over the fire, grabbed my pack, and started moving. I didn't bother packing the tent. I just needed to get to my truck. The footsteps followed me, not running, just walking, keeping pace. I moved faster, trying not to panic, my flashlight bouncing as I hurried through the trees. I could hear something behind me, matching my movements, staying just out of sight. Then, ahead, I saw the faint reflection of my truck's headlights. Relief flooded through me. I sprinted the last 100 yards, fumbling with my keys, yanking open the door. As I slammed it shut and locked it, I shined my flashlight back toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness. I turned the engine over, the headlights illuminating the forest edge. Still nothing. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into drive and got out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know if it was a person or something else. But I do know one thing. I will never go back to that place again. I had been camping my entire life. My parents took me every summer when I was a kid, and I kept the tradition going with my own family. I never considered myself the paranoid type, but there were times when nature had a way of making you feel small, vulnerable even. This trip was one of those times. It was early fall, the perfect time for camping in my opinion. The summer crowds were gone, and the crisp air made sleeping outside comfortable. My wife and I had planned this trip months in advance. A weekend away in the woods of southern Indiana. Just the two of us. The kids were with my parents, which meant for the first time in years we could actually relax. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. The campsite was remote, about a 20-minute drive from the nearest paved road. That's exactly what we wanted. Quiet, seclusion, and nature. We set up camp efficiently, our years of experience showing in how smoothly everything came together. Tent up, firewood gathered, and dinner started before the last light of the day disappeared. By nightfall, the fire crackled, and we sat in our camping chairs, sipping hot coffee from tin mugs. It was peaceful, the only sounds being the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was perfect. That night, I woke up abruptly. I wasn't sure what had roused me at first. My wife slept soundly beside me. I listened, holding my breath, but heard nothing out of the ordinary, just the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. I told myself it was nothing and drifted back to sleep. The next day passed without incident. We hiked a few miles, gathered more firewood, and cooked dinner over the open flames. But that night, it happened again. I woke up suddenly, my body rigid with a tension I couldn't explain. This time, I heard something, a faint, rhythmic rustling just outside the tent. I held my breath and listened, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate, too steady. It almost sounded like footsteps, but not quite. I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and peered outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the campsite. Nothing. I scanned the darkness beyond but saw no movement. The forest was still. After a few minutes, I crawled back inside, chalking it up to an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer passing through. The third night, I woke up again, this time with a jolt of adrenaline that had my pulse pounding in my ears. I lay still, straining to hear, and then I heard it, the same sound, a rustling, soft but purposeful. It was close, just outside the tent. My mind raced through possibilities: deer, raccoon, coyote, but none of those seemed right. The sound was too steady, too methodical. I reached for the flashlight, hand shaking slightly. I unzipped the tent slowly, careful not to make a sound. The air outside was cold, my breath visible in the dim light. I clicked on the flashlight and swept it around the campsite. And that's when I saw it. Footprints. They were fresh, imprinted in the soft earth, leading from the tree line to our tent. My stomach turned. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. I stood up slowly, shining the light toward the trees. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, but I saw nothing. Whoever had made those prints wasn't there anymore. Or maybe they were just beyond the reach of my light. I turned back to the tent and woke my wife, keeping my voice low. I told her we needed to leave. Now, she didn't ask questions. She must have seen the look on my face. We packed up as fast as we could, stuffing things into bags without caring about organization. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the car keys. We didn't look back as we drove away, leaving the campfire smoldering. I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. We reached the nearest town an hour later, stopping at a gas station. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, I finally exhaled. The next day, I went back with a buddy. I needed to know. We found the campsite just as we left it, but the footprints were gone, completely erased, as if they had never been there at all. But I know what I saw, and I know someone was out there watching us in the dark. Camping has always been something I enjoyed. The simplicity of being outdoors, the quiet escape from the buzzing world. It made me feel at peace. So when I had the chance to take a solo camping trip to a secluded site deep in the woods, I didn't hesitate. I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and drove out early in the morning. The plan was simple: spend 3 nights in the wilderness, away from everything. The drive itself was uneventful at first. The roads were mostly empty, and as I got closer to my destination, civilization faded away. No houses, no gas stations, just miles of forest stretching on either side. The last few miles were nothing but a dirt road, rough and narrow. Tall trees leaned in from both sides, their branches nearly touching overhead. I remember feeling an odd sense of isolation, as if I had left the real world behind and entered some forgotten place. Setting up camp, I reached my campsite by mid-afternoon. It was a clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a small creek running nearby. The only sign that anyone had ever been here was the remains of an old fire pit, now filled with ash and broken branches. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered enough wood for a fire. The silence was almost overwhelming. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the sound of wind moving through the trees. First night, as night fell, the forest came alive with noises. Crickets chirped, unseen animals moved in the underbrush, and the occasional owl hooted somewhere in the distance. I sat by the fire, eating my simple meal, feeling content but alert. There was a strange sensation in the air, like the forest was watching me. It wasn't fear, not yet, just an awareness of how alone I was. I crawled into my tent around midnight. The air was cool, and the forest outside was still. I fell asleep easily but woke up sometime later to a sound I couldn't immediately place. It was distant, a dull thudding noise, like something heavy moving through the woods. It wasn't an animal. Animals are stealthy. This was deliberate. I listened for a long time, heart pounding, but eventually the sound faded and exhaustion pulled me back into sleep. Day 2, the morning was calm. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and everything felt normal again. I convinced myself I had imagined the sound or that it was just some natural noise I wasn't familiar with. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking through the dense woods, enjoying the solitude. But something felt off. Every so often, I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, just beyond the trees. Shadows shifting, a flicker of something too big to be a deer, too smooth to be a branch swaying. Every time I turned, there was nothing, just empty forest. Second night, I built my fire larger that night, pushing back the darkness as much as I could. I stayed up later than I planned, staring into the trees, waiting for something I couldn't name. And then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. The thudding, closer this time. Steady, deliberate steps. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, moose, maybe even another person. But something about the sound was wrong. I turned off my lantern and sat completely still, barely breathing. The fire crackled, but beyond that, the woods were silent now. Too silent. And then, a sound even worse than the footsteps. Breathing. Slow, measured breaths, just beyond the tree line. Close enough that I should be able to see whatever it was. But I saw nothing. Primal fear took hold. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees, expecting to see glowing eyes, an animal, something. But there was nothing. The breathing stopped. The footsteps were gone. The woods were just woods again. But I wasn't convinced. The decision to leave, I barely slept. Every small noise set me on edge. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. 3 nights be damned. I packed up in record time, stuffing my gear into my truck without care for neatness. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. Not paranoia, something real. I turned the key, and the truck rumbled to life. Relief washed over me, but as I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and I saw it, a figure, standing in the clearing where my tent had been. Too far to make out details, but unmistakably human-shaped. Just standing there, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I reached the highway, until I saw other cars, other people. Only then did I breathe again. I never went back. Never tried to find out who or what I saw. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some silences aren't empty. And some footsteps don't belong to anything you want to meet. I had been camping most of my life, but this trip felt different from the moment I stepped out of the truck. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes you feel like you're carrying an extra layer. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor like fingers reaching for something unseen. The campsite was deep in the woods, far from any major roads, and the silence was heavy. No distant hum of cars, no buzzing of streetlights, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the sound of my own breath. I set up my tent quickly, trying to shake the feeling creeping up my spine. It wasn't fear, exactly, just an uneasiness I couldn't quite place. The trees stood too still, the wind never quite reaching them, and the birds had long since gone quiet. I told myself it was just the solitude playing tricks on me. By the time my fire was going, the sky had turned a deep navy blue, speckled with stars. The only source of light was the flickering flame in front of me. I cooked a simple meal, eating in silence, and let the warmth of the fire settle my nerves. But something wasn't right. Every so often, I thought I heard movement just beyond the tree line, soft but deliberate. An animal, probably. That's what I told myself, anyway. Hours passed, and the fire died down to embers. I decided to turn in for the night, zipping myself inside the tent, cocooned in fabric and false security. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling of the tent, trying to focus on the steady rhythm of my breathing. Sleep came in fragments, light, restless. Then something woke me, a sound, a deep, rhythmic crunching footsteps on dry leaves. My entire body tensed. I held my breath, straining to listen. They weren't fast, not the hurried movement of an animal, but slow, deliberate, human. I reached for the knife I always kept by my side when camping alone, my fingers tightening around the handle. The footsteps circled my tent once, twice. My heart pounded so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. Then silence. Long, stretching silence that made my ears ring. I waited. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. My body refused to stay alert any longer. And at some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke to the soft glow of morning light filtering through the tent fabric. I sat up too quickly, my neck stiff from sleeping in such a tense position. Everything was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet, morning quiet, where birds chirped and the forest felt alive again. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe my paranoia had gotten the best of me. But when I stepped out of the tent, my blood ran cold. Around my campsite, in the damp morning soil, were footprints. Large, unmistakably human footprints. They circled my tent in careful, deliberate loops. And then nothing. No path leading away. Just the prints, stopping abruptly as if whoever had been there had simply vanished. I packed up in record time, threw my gear into the truck and left without a second thought. I didn't look back, not once. I've camped plenty of times since, but never there, and never alone. It was supposed to be a normal camping trip, just a weekend in the woods, some fresh air, a break from the noise of everyday life. I packed my gear, threw everything into the back of my truck, and set out early Friday morning. The plan was simple. Drive up to a secluded spot in the Hoosier National Forest, set up camp, and just enjoy the quiet for a couple of nights. The drive was uneventful, mostly winding roads flanked by tall trees, the occasional stretch of farmland breaking up the scenery. I'd chosen a spot deep in the forest, far from the usual campsites, somewhere I wouldn't have to deal with noisy hikers or families with kids. I wanted solitude. I found it. The site was perfect. A small clearing with a decent view of a nearby creek, surrounded by thick trees. Felt remote, untouched. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and just sat for a while, listening. There was something peaceful about being so far from everything. Just the sounds of the forest, the crackling of the fire, the occasional rustling in the underbrush. But as the sun started to set, that peace turned into something else. It was subtle at first. The way the woods seemed too quiet, how the usual sounds of birds and insects faded too quickly into silence. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to being this isolated. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I woke up to a sound outside my tent. It wasn't an animal noise, not the skittering of small creatures or the distant howl of a coyote. This was deliberate, slow, steady footsteps circling my campsite. I stayed perfectly still, listening. My heart was pounding. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. No movement, no sign of anything out of place. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my nerves, maybe a deer wandering too close. I tried to sleep, but it was a restless night. The next morning, I checked the perimeter of my campsite. The ground was damp from the night's humidity, soft enough that anything walking through should have left tracks. There was nothing, no prints, no sign of movement. It didn't make sense, but I pushed it out of my mind and focused on enjoying the day. I spent most of Saturday exploring the area, hiking along the creek, taking in the scenery. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was dipping low again, casting long shadows through the trees. As I gathered wood for the fire, I had that same feeling from the night before, that sense of being watched. The skin on the back of my neck prickled, but every time I turned around, I saw nothing. That night it happened again. The footsteps, but this time they were closer. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight, waiting. The footsteps circled the tent again, slow and deliberate. I wasn't imagining this. Someone or something was out there. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? Some kind of animal? But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations made sense. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped, right outside the entrance to my tent. I could feel the weight of something or someone, standing just inches away from the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was outside. I forced myself to stay silent, barely breathing, my fingers tight around the handle of my hunting knife. I sat like that for what felt like an eternity, until finally, after what must have been hours, the sound of footsteps retreated back into the forest. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as fast as I could and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, the safety of civilization finally within reach. I don't know what was out there with me that night. I don't know who or what was walking around my campsite watching me, but I do know one thing: I won't be camping alone again. I don't usually get scared while camping. I've spent enough nights in the woods to know what's normal and what isn't. I've heard coyotes yipping in the distance, raccoons rifling through bags left outside, and even once saw a black bear sniffing around before it shuffled away. None of that really gets to me. Nature is predictable, and as long as you respect it, you'll be fine. But this trip was different. It started as a last-minute decision. I had a free weekend and figured I'd drive out to a spot I hadn't been to before. An old, nearly abandoned campsite deep in the forest. It wasn't too far from civilization, maybe an hour's drive from town, but it was secluded enough that I'd have some peace. The online reviews mentioned it being overgrown and not well maintained, but that didn't bother me. If anything, that made it more appealing. I packed light, just the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, a small cooler with food, and a few other things. I got there late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the tree line. The road leading in was rough, potholes deep enough to make me slow down to a crawl. When I finally reached the clearing, I realized the reviews hadn't lied. The campsite was in bad shape. Fire pits were filled with charred debris and empty beer cans. The old wooden picnic tables were cracked and weathered, some even missing whole planks. Still, I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked a quick meal. As the last bit of daylight faded, I sat back and listened to the forest. It was quiet, eerily so. No wind rustling through the trees, no distant howls or hoots from animals, just silence. I chalked it up to the time of year. Maybe the animals had already moved on for the season. Around midnight, I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep, but something kept me restless. It wasn't a sound that woke me, it was the absence of sound. I've camped enough to know that the woods are never truly silent. Even on the stillest nights, there's always something. A cricket, the creak of trees, the distant movement of some nocturnal animal. But this was nothing, not a single noise. Lying in my sleeping bag, I felt an unease settle into my chest. I listened harder, trying to hear anything at all. And then, faintly, I did. A single, deliberate footstep. It wasn't the scuttling of a small animal or the shifting of the earth. It was a footstep, slow, heavy, and too close to my tent. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Another step, then another. Whoever or whatever it was moving deliberately, not wandering, not lost. It knew exactly where it was going. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the thin fabric of my tent. The light illuminated nothing unusual, but that didn't ease my nerves. The footsteps had stopped. I stayed still for what felt like hours, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers ached. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. I woke up at first light, groggy but alert. The fire had long since burned out, and the cold morning air was thick with dew. I stepped out of my tent and scanned the area, searching for any sign that someone had been nearby. The dirt around my campsite was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken twigs, nothing. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I'd been half asleep, my mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw my cooler. It had been moved just slightly. It was closer to the fire pit than where I had left it. The lid was still closed, the latch still secured, but it was definitely not where I had placed it the night before. I packed up quickly after that. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe I had just been careless when I set it down. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had been there, watching, moving my things, maybe testing how aware I was. I never went back to that campsite. I don't even tell people where it was. But sometimes, when I'm out in the woods, I think about that night, about the silence, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched, and I wonder who or what was out there with me in the dark.